I'm Chris, 28 years old, and last night my life turned upside down in a way I still can't fully process. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through job postings on my laptop, when my father stormed in like a hurricane. No warning. No, we need to talk. Just a thick envelope of papers slapped down in front of me, so hard my coffee almost tipped over. "You're a failure," he said, his voice sharp and cold. "You have 12 hours to get out. Your brother owns this house now." I just sat there frozen, staring at the papers, not fully registering what I was seeing. Eviction papers. Signed, notarized, and ready to go. I'm not new to my dad's outbursts. He's always been a man who measured worth by paychecks and titles. But this was different. This wasn't yelling or some offhand insult about me being behind in life. This was calculated, planned, and he looked almost proud of himself as he stood there watching me read. "Maybe this will finally teach you some responsibility," he sneered. The house we were sitting in was my childhood home. My mom's favorite curtains still hung in the living room windows. My brother and I had built a tree house in the backyard together when we were kids. It was the one place that had always felt safe, and now I was being told I had less than half a day before it wasn't mine anymore. I asked why, my voice shaky. That was when Dad smirked and said, almost casually, "Your brother just bought it from me. He's the owner now. Consider this a lesson in what happens when you waste your life." For context, my older brother, Mark, has always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Straight A student, star athlete, first in the family to get a master's degree. If Mark sneezed, my dad acted like he'd cured the common cold. I, on the other hand, have always been, well, me, the quieter one. The kid who liked to draw instead of play football, who got decent grades but never shined. After college, I bounced between jobs trying to figure out what I really wanted to do, and for my dad, that was apparently the ultimate sin. I should have been angry, and I was, but what hit me first was this strange hollow feeling, like my chest had been scooped out. I thought about all the times I'd stayed late helping Dad with house repairs, the birthdays and holidays we'd spent under this roof, the nights I'd fallen asleep on the couch after long shifts because I didn't want to wake anyone up by making noise. None of it mattered. To him, I was just expendable. Mark wasn't home when this happened. He's been living with his girlfriend downtown for months. But apparently he swooped in at the perfect time to buy the house, as Dad put it. I could already imagine his smug grin when he'd find out he had the power to kick me out. And here's the thing. I don't think Mark even needed the house. He has a high-paying job, a fancy apartment, and barely even visits this place. This wasn't about practicality. This was about control. I took a deep breath, stood up, and just said, "Okay." Dad seemed almost annoyed that I didn't argue. He told me I had until noon today to pack up and leave, then walked out without another word. I sat back down at the table, staring at those papers for a long time. The anger came later, hot and sharp, making my hands shake, but right then, all I felt was cold. I didn't sleep much. I started packing right away, shoving my clothes into trash bags and stacking boxes of my things in the living room. Every creak of the floorboards made me tense. Every time I heard a car outside, my heart jumped, half expecting Mark to come strolling in early to gloat. I kept replaying Dad's words in my head. "You're a failure." It wasn't just the eviction. It was everything those words carried. Years of disappointment, comparisons, and the unspoken message that no matter what I did, I'd never be good enough. By morning, I had most of my stuff piled by the door. The house felt eerily empty without my things in it, like I was already a ghost. That's when I heard tires crunching on the driveway. A car door slammed. Footsteps. And then the sound of the front door unlocking. Mark was here. I wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to steady myself. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe a confrontation, maybe some smug lecture about how this was for my own good. But as the door swung open and he stepped inside, something in his expression shifted the moment he saw me standing there. And that's when I knew. This was about to get very, very interesting. Mark didn't even close the door behind him at first. He just stood there on the threshold, keys still in his hand, staring at me like I was some stray animal that had wandered into his new property. He had that look on his face, the one I've seen 100 times, a mix of pity and superiority that always made me feel about 2 feet tall. "Well," he said finally, letting out a little laugh as he stepped inside. "You're still here. Thought Dad told you to clear out last night." I didn't say anything right away. My throat felt dry, and I wasn't sure if anything I said would come out calm. My things were stacked by the door in neat piles, my whole life compressed into bags and boxes, and Mark's eyes immediately went to them. "Guess you actually listened for once," he said, sounding almost surprised. "Good. This doesn't have to be ugly, Chris. You just, move out, figure yourself out, and maybe one day you'll thank me for giving you the push you needed." That was the first spark of real anger. The way he said, "Thank me," like this was some grand favor he was doing for me. I forced myself to stay still, to keep my voice even when I finally answered. "This house was Mom's too," I said. "You really think she'd want me thrown out like this?" Mark shrugged, already making himself at home. He tossed his jacket on the couch like he owned the place, which, technically, he did now. "Mom's not here, is she? And Dad signed it over, so—" He trailed off and gave me a little smirk. "You can't keep living off him forever, Chris. You're 28. Most people have their own place by now." I clenched my jaw. Most people didn't have their father secretly sell the house out from under them to their older brother either. But saying that wouldn't change anything, and Mark knew it. He was enjoying this, the power shift, the fact that for once he had something tangible over me. He walked around the living room slowly, like he was inspecting it, and I realized with a sick feeling that he was already imagining all the ways he'd change things once I was gone. He stopped by the shelf where I'd kept some old framed photos, me and him as kids, all three of us with Mom before she passed, and picked one up. "You should probably take this with you," he said casually. "I'll be redecorating soon." Something about that hit me harder than the eviction papers had. The idea that he'd just wipe away the last traces of Mom in this house, like she'd never been here. "Read." I started, then stopped, shaking my head. "Wow, you don't waste any time, do you?" Mark turned to look at me with that fake, calm smile that always came out before he said something cutting. "Chris, this place needs a refresh. You've been stuck here like a ghost for years. It's time to let go. You can't hold on to the past forever." I wanted to tell him that this house was more than walls and furniture, that every corner had memories that kept me grounded, but I knew he wouldn't get it. To him, everything was about appearances, upgrades, moving forward. He never stayed still long enough to sit with loss, to feel grief the way I had after Mom died. Instead, I just asked, "Did Dad tell you to say all this? Or is this just you being yourself?" Mark's smile faltered for a moment, and then he gave a small shrug. "Dad and I just want what's best for you. Look, you've been spinning your wheels for years. This is your chance to actually do something with your life. You should be grateful." Grateful. That word echoed in my head like a bad joke. Grateful for being blindsided. Grateful for losing the only place that still felt like home. Grateful that my father and brother decided, without so much as a conversation, that they knew what was best for me. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "You know, Mark, you've always had everything handed to you. Dad's support, the money, the attention, and now this house. You ever stop and wonder if maybe you didn't earn all of it?" He stiffened at that, his jaw tightening, but he didn't respond right away. Then he said, "You know what? I think you're just jealous. You've always been jealous of me." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how predictable it was. "Jealous?" I repeated. "Of you?" "No, Mark. I'm just tired. Tired of being treated like I'm the family disappointment just because I don't live my life exactly how Dad wants me to. Tired of being compared to you like we're in some competition I never agreed to." He rolled his eyes. "Here we go? The victim's speech." That did it. I grabbed one of the boxes by the door, hoisted it up, and marched past him toward my car. If he wanted me gone so badly, fine. I'd go. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down over it. I made a few trips back and forth, loading up my car while Mark lingered in the living room, occasionally calling out unhelpful comments like, "Don't scratch the walls," and "Be careful with the door frame." He wasn't just watching me leave, he was reveling in it. At one point, I came back inside to grab my sketchbooks, and I saw him on the phone with someone. "Yeah, I'll have the locks changed this afternoon," he was saying, glancing at me like he wanted me to hear. "Better to get it done before anything happens." That was when the anger boiled over into something sharper. He wasn't just pushing me out. He was erasing me from this house entirely. Like I'd never been part of it. Like I'd never belonged here in the first place. I took the last of my things out and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around the house one final time. Mark was sitting on the couch now, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. "Guess this is it," I said quietly. He didn't even look up. Yeah, don't be a stranger. I almost said something then, something I might have regretted, but instead, I just turned and left. My car was packed to the brim, my chest felt tight, and as I drove away, I kept telling myself I was done with them. Done trying to earn their approval. Done letting them dictate what my life should look like. But as the house grew smaller in my rearview mirror, a new thought crept in, cold, steady, and impossible to shake. If they thought I was just going to disappear quietly, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Driving away from that house felt like leaving behind a piece of myself I wasn't sure I'd ever get back. I didn't have a plan, just a car stuffed with boxes and a head full of thoughts that wouldn't stop spinning. I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, sitting there long after the engine was off. It was still early, maybe 7 a.m., but the sky was gray and heavy, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or not. My phone buzzed a few times with texts, but I didn't look. I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, breathing in and out until my hands stopped shaking. I didn't want to call anyone. I didn't want to explain what happened, or worse, hear someone tell me, well, it's their house. They can do what they want. So I started driving again, aimlessly at first, until I found myself pulling into the parking lot of the old storage facility on Maple Street. It was cheap, no questions asked, and I knew I could get a unit month to month. The guy at the counter gave me a look, probably because I looked like I hadn't slept, but handed me the key and lock. Within an hour, everything I owned was stacked inside a concrete room with a metal door. By the time I left, my phone was buzzing again. This time I looked. It was from Dad. Turn in your house key today. No exceptions. No, how are you? No, let's talk. Just a command. I texted back one word, fine. And that should have been the end of it. But a few hours later, when I went back to drop off the key, the betrayal really hit me, because this time, Mark and Dad were both there, waiting. Dad was standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed, that same disapproving frown on his face. Mark was leaning against the counter, looking far too comfortable. There were papers spread out on the table, and for a brief second, I thought maybe they'd reconsidered, that maybe they wanted to talk this out. But no, this wasn't an olive branch. Good. You're here, Dad said flatly. We need to go over a few things before you leave. I stayed near the door, wary. What things? Dad gestured to the table. Utilities, property taxes, insurance. You're still listed as a secondary on some of these accounts because you've been living here. I want to make sure everything is transferred so there are no surprises. That sounded reasonable enough, until Mark chimed in with a grin. And since you've been using Dad's internet and power all this time, we thought it was fair you cover the last few months' bills before you go. I blinked, sure I'd misheard him. Excuse me. Dad nodded like this was completely normal. You've been living here rent-free, Chris. It's only right you settle what you owe. Mark's taking on the property now. He doesn't need to deal with back expenses. Back expenses? Like I'd been freeloading. Like the countless repairs I'd done, the groceries I'd bought, the nights I'd spent keeping this house running while Dad was away on business meant nothing. You've got to be kidding me, I said, my voice low. Mark slid a printed sheet across the table. It's not that bad. A couple hundred for utilities, some upkeep costs Dad covered. Consider it a clean slate. I picked up the paper, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't a couple hundred. It was nearly $3,000. $3,000 they wanted me to pay before I left, as if I was some tenant who had skipped out on rent. That's insane, I said, tossing the paper back. I don't owe you a dime. I've been maintaining this place for years, for free. I fixed the leaky roof last winter, replaced half the appliances, painted the entire downstairs. And that was your choice, Dad interrupted sharply. You chose to do those things instead of getting your life together. You can't expect me to reward you for staying stagnant. I laughed bitterly. Reward me? You mean not throw me out on the street? Dad's face hardened. You have 12 hours. Pay what you owe, or I'll consider it theft of services. That was the moment something cracked inside me. Not just anger this time, something deeper. This wasn't just about pushing me out anymore. This was about humiliation. They wanted me to leave broke, small, ashamed. I set the house key on the table slowly. Here's your key, I said, my voice shaking. That's all you're getting from me. Mark frowned, but Dad just shrugged. Suit yourself. But don't come crawling back here when you realize how hard the world is. I turned to leave, but Mark couldn't resist getting in one last jab. You know, he said, smirking, once I finish the remodel, This place is going to be worth twice what Dad sold it to me for. Probably the best investment I've ever made. You really missed out. I stopped in the doorway, gripping the frame so hard my knuckles went white. He wanted me to react. He wanted me to lash out so they could point and say, "See? This is why he can't handle life." But instead, I just said quietly, "Good luck, Mark. Hope it was worth it." I walked out and didn't look back. But as soon as I was in the car, the tears came, hot, angry, unstoppable. I wasn't crying because I'd lost the house. I was crying because I'd finally realized the truth. It wasn't just the house they didn't want me to have. It was a place in this family. I spent that night sleeping in my car outside the storage facility. I couldn't bring myself to call friends or look for a motel. I just sat there under the hum of the streetlight, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything. My dad's words. Mark's smug grin. The $3,000 bill. The way they looked at me like I was nothing. By the next morning, something had shifted. The hurt was still there, raw and sharp, but beneath it was something else. A slow, simmering resolve. If they thought they'd broken me, they were wrong. If they thought I was just going to disappear quietly, they were really wrong. And then, just as I was about to start the car and look for somewhere to shower, my phone buzzed again. This time with a notification that made my blood run cold. A bank alert. I opened it, and my stomach flipped. There was a withdrawal I didn't recognize. Nearly $1,200 gone from my checking account. I immediately called the bank. After a few minutes on hold, the representative came back and confirmed it. The payment had gone through last night for shared household expenses, automatically debited from the joint account I'd been forced to share with Dad years ago when he helped me get a credit card. He'd used my own money to pay part of that bill. That was it. That was the breaking point. The last thread of trust snapped clean in two. When I hung up the phone, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands hurt, until the sun came up. The betrayal wasn't just complete, it was weaponized. And I knew, right then, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Rock bottom didn't hit me all at once. It crept in, quietly, like fog rolling over a field at dawn. I left the bank parking lot that morning feeling hollow, numb. The car smelled faintly of stale fast food from the night before, and the back seat was crammed with my life in boxes and bags. I drove aimlessly for a while until I ended up at the edge of town, parked near the river. The air was damp and chilly, but I rolled down the window anyway. It felt good to feel something, even if it was just the sting of cold air on my face. I spent most of that day sitting there, staring at the water and trying to piece together what the last 48 hours had done to me. My childhood home, gone. My dad's respect, if he'd ever had any for me, shattered. My brother, a stranger wearing a familiar face. And now they'd taken money straight from my account without even asking. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through job postings again, but every listing I saw felt like a mountain I didn't have the strength to climb. Most wanted a stable address, references, sometimes even credit checks. I had none of that now. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Eventually, I drove to the cheapest motel I could find, a two-story place with flickering neon lights and a front desk clerk who didn't even look up from her crossword puzzle when I checked in. The room smelled faintly of bleach, but it had 4 walls, a bed, and a shower, and that was enough. The first night, I slept for nearly 14 hours. When I woke up, my body felt like it had been through a war. My phone had more messages, mostly from Dad, some short, some longer, all with the same tone. You need to grow up. This is the real world. Take responsibility for once. I didn't reply. Instead, I took a long shower, put on clean clothes, and forced myself to do something productive. I drove to a cafe with free Wi-Fi and spent the entire day researching everything I could about property transfers, eviction rights, and joint bank accounts. The legal jargon was dizzying, but I took notes, slowly starting to see where there might be cracks in what Dad and Mark had done. It wasn't much, just the faintest glimmer of control, but it was enough to keep me from spiraling completely. Still, the days blurred together. I'd wake up late, drive to the cafe or library, send out a few job applications, then go back to the motel and stare at the ceiling until I fell asleep again. Money was draining fast. The savings I had left were just enough to cover a couple more weeks at the motel, maybe a month if I cut back hard. And then came the moment that made me feel truly, fully humiliated. One afternoon, I ran into an old neighbor at the grocery store. She was sweet, one of those people who always waved when she saw me growing up. She looked surprised to see me. "Chris," she said, smiling. "I heard about the house. Mark mentioned you moved out. How are you holding up?" There it was again. Mark, talking about me like he was the generous brother who'd helped his poor lost sibling move on. I forced a polite smile. "I'm okay," I lied. "Just figuring things out." She patted my arm sympathetically. "Well, I'm glad Mark's finally getting a chance to make that house his own. He's so responsible, isn't he? Your dad must be proud." The words landed like a punch. I nodded, made some excuse about having to go, and left. But inside, I was boiling. That was when it hit me. They weren't just erasing me from the house. They were rewriting the entire story. To the outside world, I was just the screw-up who finally left so the golden child could swoop in and save the family home. That night, back at the motel, I sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop open and my notes spread out in front of me. For the first time, I let myself really think about what I wanted, not just how to survive. Part of me wanted to just disappear, to walk away completely, find a new city, a new life, and never look back. It would be easier than staying here, where every street corner had a memory. But then I thought about Mark's smug grin, Dad's words, the money taken from my account, and a different feeling rose up, slow, steady, like coals catching fire. I started looking into more than just property law. I looked up local business records, tax filings, even social media posts. I wasn't sure what I was looking for yet, just that I needed to know everything about Dad, about Mark, about how the house deal had gone down. The more I read, the more pieces started clicking together. There were odd details about the sale, unusually fast processing, a transfer price that seemed lower than market value. That might not mean much by itself, but it was enough to make me wonder. I also found something about the joint account. Legally, my dad wasn't supposed to use it without my consent now that I was an adult. That $1,200 withdrawal? Potentially disputable. For the first time since this all started, I felt a tiny spark of control return. It didn't make the next few days any easier. I still had to ration every dollar, still slept on a lumpy motel mattress, still woke up some mornings with that heavy feeling in my chest that made it hard to move. But now I had a notebook full of plans, lists of questions to ask, documents to pull. And every time I thought about giving up, I'd picture Mark standing in that living room, casually talking about changing the locks like I was some trespasser in my own home. I wasn't ready yet, not even close. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was waiting, watching, gathering. Because if there was one thing I was sure of now, it was this. They weren't going to get away with it forever. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I got a call that sent my plans into overdrive. A call that changed everything about how I saw my family, the house, and the betrayal I'd just lived through. The call came late in the afternoon, just as I was packing up my things from the cafe. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved in my phone, but something made me swipe to accept. "Is this Christopher?" A calm, professional voice asked. "Yes," I said cautiously. "This is Allison from Graham and Company. Title Services. We just wanted to confirm that you're no longer a secondary signer on the house transfer documents, correct?" I froze. Title Services? House transfer? "Wait," I said slowly. "Why would I have been a signer at all?" There was a pause on the line. "Oh, I see. You weren't aware that your name was still listed on the previous title as an inheritor from your mother's estate." I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. "No," I said. "I definitely wasn't aware." "Well," Allison said carefully, "it was removed during the transfer, but we're required to notify you as a courtesy. We sent a notice by mail." I almost laughed. Of course they sent it by mail, to the house I'd just been thrown out of. I thanked her for the call, hung up, and just sat there for a long time, heart hammering. My name had been on the title, which meant Dad hadn't just sold his house, he'd sold our house. Mom's house. The house that was supposed to be passed down to both me and Mark. And he hadn't said a word about it. The anger that hit me then was different from before. It was cold, sharp, focused. It wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This was about something real, something legal. They had gone behind my back to cut me out of something I had a right to. That night, back at the motel, I didn't just take notes. I started making calls. First, I called a lawyer I found online who specialized in probate and inheritance disputes. I didn't have much money, but to my surprise, the consultation was free. I told him everything. The house, the sale, the eviction, the missing money. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. "This doesn't sound right," he said finally. "If your name was on the title, you should have been given the option to sign off or challenge the sale before it was finalized. The fact that you weren't notified could give you grounds to contest the transfer." "Contest it?" I asked, sitting up straighter. "Potentially reverse it," he said. I thanked him, set up an appointment for later that week, and hung up, feeling, for the first time in weeks, like the ground was steady beneath my feet. And that was just the beginning. Over the next few days, things slowly started to shift. I got a call back from one of the jobs I'd applied for, a local design firm looking for a junior graphic designer. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to get me out of the motel. I aced the interview, got the job, and moved into a small but clean studio apartment within a week. I also disputed the $1,200 withdrawal from my account. The bank put the funds on hold while they investigated, which meant Dad couldn't touch them. Each small victory felt like stacking bricks, building something solid under my feet. I started going to the gym again. Nothing crazy, just running on the treadmill, lifting light weights. And for the first time in months, my reflection in the mirror didn't look so beaten down. My face had color again. My shoulders felt less slumped. Work became a kind of therapy. The design firm was small, with only 8 employees, but the team was welcoming and creative. They treated me like an equal. No comparisons, no subtle digs about potential. Just respect. I stayed late most nights, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And as the weeks went by, I started saving money again. I opened a new bank account, separate from anything Dad had access to, and deposited every spare dollar. Watching the balance grow, even a little at a time, was like watching a lifeline being slowly pulled toward me. But I didn't forget. Every weekend, I met with the lawyer. We gathered documents, title histories, emails. He even managed to get a copy of the house sale agreement, which showed that Dad had sold the property to Mark at a price far below market value. Something that, combined with the lack of my consent, could look very suspicious in court. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about proving that what they did was wrong, that I wasn't just some failure who had been kicked out for my own good. And the more I worked with the lawyer, the more confident I felt. I started posting more of my art online, too, something I'd been too embarrassed to do before. To my surprise, people liked it. A few even commissioned pieces. One of my designs went semi-viral on Instagram, and I got a handful of offers from bigger accounts wanting to collaborate. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something that was mine. Then, one Saturday morning, I stopped by a coffee shop near my new apartment, and there they were. Dad and Mark, sitting by the window. They saw me before I could turn around. "Chris," Dad called, his voice carrying across the cafe. I hesitated, then walked over. "You look good," Dad said, eyeing me with something that almost looked like surprise. "Heard you got a job." "That's good." Mark, on the other hand, just smirked. "Finally growing up?" he asked. I smiled, really smiled, for the first time in front of them in months. "Yeah," I said. "Actually, things are going really well." I didn't say more, but I could see the way Mark's smirk faltered just a little. When I left the cafe, I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel like the kid brother who couldn't measure up. I felt like someone standing on equal ground, maybe even taller. Because I knew something they didn't. The lawyer was nearly ready to file. The house wasn't just theirs to do with as they pleased. And soon, very soon, they were going to find that out in a way they never saw coming. And this time, I wouldn't be the one standing in the doorway, powerless. I'd be the one holding the papers. The real turning point came about 2 weeks later, when my lawyer called me into his office for what he called a strategy session. I'd been expecting just another routine update, maybe more paperwork to sign, but when I sat down across from him, he had a look on his face that told me this wasn't just routine. "I think we're ready," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Not just to contest the transfer. We can move to freeze any major renovations or sales Mark might try to make until this is resolved. And there's more." I dug into the financials for the sale. "Your dad underreported the property value by almost 40%. I frowned. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning," he said with a small smile, "that if we take this to court, not only can we argue that your consent was required, but we can make the case that this sale was a fraudulent conveyance, an attempt to move assets unfairly. If the judge agrees, the sale could be voided entirely. The house would revert back to joint ownership between you and your father, the way it was before. My breath caught. For weeks, I'd been preparing myself for the idea that the house was gone forever, that the best I could hope for was some small settlement to make up for being cut out. But this was different. This meant the whole deal could be unwound. What would happen to Mark? I asked carefully. Well, the lawyer said, leaning back, if the sale is voided, any money he paid for the property would be refunded by your father. He'd no longer own the house. And if he's already made renovations, he might not get reimbursed for those. Essentially, he'd be back to square one. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the folder. A slow, measured calm washed over me. This wasn't just revenge for revenge's sake. This was justice. This was setting the record straight. Let's do it, I said finally. File whatever you have to. The next few days were a blur of signatures, notarizations, and filings. The lawyer moved quickly, getting an injunction in place to stop any major changes to the property until the case could be heard. Meanwhile, I kept working at the design firm and quietly building up my life. The commissions online were picking up faster than I expected, and one of my designs was featured on a popular art blog, which brought in a wave of new followers. I started to feel like I had two lives running in parallel: the quiet, stable one I was building day by day, and the storm I was carefully, patiently preparing to unleash. Then came a stroke of luck that felt almost too perfect. One evening, I was at the grocery store near my new apartment when I ran into Mark's girlfriend, Emily. She looked tired, not just physically, but in that way people look when they've been putting up with something for too long. Hey, she said, managing a small smile. Didn't expect to see you here. We talked for a few minutes, just polite small talk, until she let out a sigh and said, you know, Mark's been working on that house nonstop. He's driving himself crazy trying to make it perfect. New floors, new kitchen, even talking about building a deck. He keeps saying it's going to double in value by next year. I bit back a smile. If only he knew. Then Emily hesitated, glanced around, and lowered her voice. Honestly, I don't even know why he's doing it. He doesn't plan to live there. He told me he's just going to flip it and use the profit for a down payment on a place downtown. That was the missing puzzle piece I hadn't realized I needed. If Mark was banking on flipping the house for profit, the injunction would hit him twice as hard, not just emotionally, but financially. Every dollar he poured into renovations would just sit there, locked in limbo, until the case was resolved. I thanked Emily, kept my tone neutral, but the moment I got back to my car, I called my lawyer. Good timing, he said when I explained what I'd learned. We can add that to our filing. Show that Mark's improvements are speculative and that you stand to lose financially if he's allowed to keep making changes unchecked. Each step felt like tightening a noose, not out of malice, but out of precision. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't on the back foot. I was in control. Even at work, people noticed the change. My boss called me into her office one afternoon and said, I don't know what's going on in your life, Chris, but you've been on fire lately. Your designs are sharper. You seem confident. I smiled at that because she was right. I felt taller, lighter, even when I was exhausted from long days. There was a part of me that had woken up, a part that refused to be stepped on ever again. A few weeks later, I got the court date. 2 months from now. That night, I celebrated quietly. I ordered takeout, sat in my apartment surrounded by my sketchbooks, and raised a glass of soda like it was champagne. I imagined the look on Mark's face when he got served. The way Dad's smug certainty would crack when he realized this wasn't going away. But I didn't want to just blindside them. No, that would be too easy. I wanted them to feel safe first, to think they'd really won. So I started being polite when I ran into them. Civil, even. If Dad texted, I answered with short, respectful replies. If Mark called to brag about the remodel, I listened, offered a neutral sounds good, and hung up. Let them think I'd accepted my lesson. Let them think I was finally playing the obedient son and brother. Because when the moment came, I wanted the ground to fall out from under them all at once. And then, just when everything was in place, I got an email from the lawyer with the final document attached. This is it, the subject line read. I opened it and stared at the PDF for a long time, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just paper. This was my voice. My chance to stand up and say, you don't get to erase me. I hit send on the signed version, leaned back in my chair, and felt something I hadn't felt since the day this all began: peace. It wasn't over yet. Far from it. But the pieces were all on the board now. And for the first time, I wasn't just playing defense. I was the one setting the trap. The summons went out on a rainy Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday, my phone started buzzing. First it was Mark, then Dad, both leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. "Chris, what is this?" Mark's voice snapped through the speaker. "You're suing us? Over the house. Are you out of your mind?" I let the call go to voicemail and didn't respond. 2 hours later, Dad called. "You don't know what you're doing, son. These things cost money. Time. You'll regret this." I didn't respond to that either. For weeks, I stayed silent, calm. While they stewed, I kept working, kept saving, kept getting stronger. I wasn't going to be baited into an argument that would give them any power over me. When the day of the preliminary hearing finally came, I arrived early. I wore my best button-down shirt, the one that actually fit me well now that I'd been taking care of myself, and I carried my folder neatly under my arm. My lawyer met me at the courthouse steps, nodding in approval. "You ready?" he asked. "More than ready," I said. Mark and Dad arrived late. Of course they did. Dad looked irritated, like this whole thing was beneath him. Mark looked smug, but with an edge of nervousness that hadn't been there before. When we sat down in the courtroom, the judge asked my lawyer to present first. He stood, calm and professional, and laid everything out in clear, sharp language. The original title that still had my name listed, the lack of proper notice, the sale below market value, the automatic withdrawal from my account. He showed the injunction we'd already filed to halt renovations and explained that allowing Mark to continue would cause irreparable financial harm to me as a co-heir. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat when he heard the phrase co-heir. Mark turned to look at me, eyes wide for a second, before quickly schooling his expression back into something neutral. Their lawyer stood next, arguing that the sale was legal and that I had no right to interfere with Mark's use of the property. But the judge cut him off halfway through. "If what Mr. Graham is presenting is accurate," she said, glancing at the documents, "then this court has serious concerns about how this sale was conducted. The case will proceed to a full hearing." She banged the gavel. Just like that, we were moving forward. Outside the courthouse, Mark stormed up to me, his face red. "You can't do this," he hissed. "Do you have any idea how much money I've put into that place?" I looked him dead in the eye, calm as I'd ever been, and said, "Then I guess you should have thought about that before you kicked me out." Dad stepped forward, trying to intimidate me like he always had when I was younger. "You're tearing this family apart, Chris." I met his gaze evenly. "No," I said quietly. "You did that when you sold Mom's house behind my back." For a moment, Dad's expression faltered. Just a flicker. And then he turned away without another word. Over the next few weeks, I started to hear things, whispers through the grapevine. Apparently, Mark had sunk almost all of his savings into the remodel. New floors, new kitchen, custom deck. He'd even taken out a small loan, banking on flipping the house quickly to pay it off. Now, thanks to the injunction, he couldn't rent it, sell it, or even finish some of the renovations without violating the court order. I didn't gloat. Not outwardly. I kept my head down, kept working, kept building my case. But inside, I won't lie, it felt good. Not because he was suffering, but because for once, the scales were balanced. For once, I wasn't the one paying the price for someone else's decisions. And then came the day we'd all been waiting for, the full hearing. The courtroom was bigger this time, with more people in attendance. I took a deep breath as I sat down, feeling the weight of the moment. My lawyer went first again, presenting our evidence. He showed the title history, the estate documents from when Mom passed, the lack of proper notice, the undervalued sale price. He even brought in an expert witness who testified that the sale price was far below market and that bypassing my consent had directly harmed my share of the estate. Then it was Dad and Mark's turn. Their lawyer tried to argue that I'd never contributed financially to the house, that I'd been living off their generosity. But my lawyer was ready for that. "We have bank statements showing Mr. Graham paid for repairs, utilities, and maintenance for years," he said, handing over the documents. Not only was he contributing, but his contributions increased the property value that was later transferred without his consent. The judge listened carefully, asking questions now and then. And then, after what felt like hours, she finally spoke. "This court finds sufficient grounds to void the sale of the property," she said. The house will revert to joint ownership between Mr. Graham and his father until a proper division can be arranged. Furthermore, any funds withdrawn from Mr. Graham's account without authorization are to be reimbursed in full. I sat there stunned for a moment, the words sinking in. We'd done it. Mark's face went pale. Dad's jaw tightened. When we stepped out of the courtroom, Mark rounded on me again. Do you have any idea what you've done? He shouted. I just lost months of work, thousands of dollars. I looked at him steadily. You didn't lose it, I said. You just invested in something that isn't yours alone. Dad didn't say anything this time. He just stared at me for a long moment. Something complicated in his expression. Anger, maybe, but also something else. Something that almost looked like respect. I turned to leave, feeling the weight slide off my shoulders with every step. This wasn't the final chapter. Not yet, but the power dynamic had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one on my knees asking for scraps. And they knew it. The next move was mine. The weeks that followed the court's decision felt surreal, like watching a chess game where, for once, every move went in my favor. The house, now legally back under joint ownership, was effectively frozen until Dad and I came to a formal agreement on how to divide the property. That meant Mark's grand flip and cash-out plan was dead in the water. He couldn't sell. He couldn't rent. He couldn't even legally finish some of the work he'd started without my signature. I didn't rush to make any decisions. Part of me wanted to walk away entirely, to just let them stew, but I knew if I did, Dad would eventually pressure me to sell my share for pennies just to make this easier. So instead, I played it slow. The first time I went back to the house after the ruling was a moment I'll never forget. The new floors Mark had put in gleamed under the light. The kitchen had been gutted halfway through, and construction dust coated the counters. He was there when I arrived, sitting at the island with a beer in his hand, looking exhausted. You happy now? He asked bitterly, not even looking at me. I walked through the house slowly, my footsteps echoing. It didn't even feel like home anymore. Not really, but it was still mine. Not happy, I said finally. Just done letting you both decide what my life is worth. He slammed the beer down on the counter. You ruined me, Chris. I maxed out my savings and took out a loan for this place. Now I can't even sell it. I'm stuck. I turned to face him, calm but firm. You're stuck because you tried to erase me from this house. You made a choice. And you made it worse by gloating while you kicked me out. Actions have consequences, Mark. Welcome to yours. He didn't say anything after that, just stared at the floor. Dad, on the other hand, called me later that night. His voice was tight, controlled. Your brother is under a lot of stress right now, he said. You've made your point. Why don't you agree to sell your share so we can put this behind us? Because my share is worth more now than it ever was, I said. And I'm not in a hurry. I want this done right. Fairly. For the first time. There was a long pause. Then Dad said, You're not the same kid you used to be. No, I said. I'm not. And you don't get to treat me like him anymore. That conversation marked a shift I could feel in my bones. The next time we met, it wasn't him towering over me, demanding things. It was two equals sitting at a table. He offered to buy out my share at fair market value, not the insulting family discount he would have tried 6 months ago. I agreed, but only after adding a clause that required him to reimburse me for every dollar taken from my account and for the repairs I'd funded over the years. When the check cleared, I put a down payment on a condo of my own. Small? Yes, but bright and new and fully mine. The first night I slept there, I stood in the empty living room with my laptop open, playing Mom's favorite song just to let it fill the space. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Meanwhile, word spread through the family about what had happened. My aunt called to say she was proud of me for standing up for myself. Even Grandma, who had always favored Mark, called to say she thought Dad had been too harsh and that she was glad I'd fought back. As for Mark, he had to finish paying off the loan he'd taken for renovations and eventually scraped together enough to buy out Dad's remaining share. By the time it was finally his, the market had dipped and he ended up losing money on the sale a year later. I didn't gloat, but I won't pretend I didn't feel a small, quiet satisfaction knowing that life had handed him the lesson he'd tried to hand me. The last time I saw them both together was at a family gathering months later. The tension in the air was thick, but I didn't shrink the way I used to. I walked in, shoulders squared, head high, wearing a new suit I'd bought with the bonus I'd earned from a major design project at work. Mark didn't say much, just nodded stiffly. Dad gave me a long look across the table, then said, "I hear you're doing well for yourself." "I am," I said simply. "Better than ever." And that was the truth. As dinner wound down, I stood, ready to leave. I looked at both of them. The father who had dismissed me as a failure, the brother who had treated me like a problem to be solved. And I felt no anger anymore. Just clarity. "I want you both to know something," I said, my voice steady. "What you did hurt me more than I can explain. But it also forced me to grow in ways I never would have otherwise. You thought you were teaching me a lesson about responsibility. Turns out, I learned one about self-respect." I turned and walked out, the room silent behind me. As I stepped into the cool night air, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything to them. I didn't need to. Because they finally understood, I wasn't the one who'd been cut out of the family. They were the ones who'd lost me. And I was never going back.